PSYOPs, or psychological operations, is a term used to describe the techniques of psychological manipulation used in warfare. These operations are used to deceive, confuse, disrupt, and demoralize the enemy, with an aim toward weakening enemy resistance, or even causing enemy forces to surrender, and enemy populations to capitulate. As the flip side to the ancient wisdom that knowledge is key to all successful warfare strategies, the art of deliberately sowing deception has been understood and practiced for thousands of years. The old adage that knowledge is power has been apparent to warriors and would-be rulers throughout history. A well-known illustration from the annals of history revolves around Nathan Rothschild, the British representative of Mayer Amschel's infamous Rothschild banking dynasty. At the Battle of Waterloo, Rothschild's riders and messengers were able to get news of Napoleon's defeat home to Nathan a full day in advance of the government's own news carriers. As the story goes, Nathan was able to convince the public that he had in fact received news of Wellington's defeat by selling heavily on the English stock market. When panic selling ensued, Rothschild had his agents buying up the stocks at pennies on the pound. By the time the news of Napoleon's defeat reached Britain's shores, Rothschild had already secured his position as one of the richest men in Britain, a fortune that was only further leveraged in the ensuing years, lending post-war stabilization funds to Europe's monarchies. Regardless of the story's historical veracity, it serves to illustrate the fundamental precept: knowledge is indeed power. It also suggests a corollary. Misinformation is a way of leveraging one's power over an enemy. This too is an ancient idea that has been used throughout the centuries as a tool of psychological warfare to confer one's army an advantage over its enemies. Military deception is an ancient and time-honored art. Throughout recorded history, military commanders have attempted to spread false news and seed false information as part of psychological warfare operations to deceive, confuse, and demoralize the enemy. During the Crusades in 1271, Sultan Baybars successfully took the Crusaders' crack des Chevaliers in Syria by conveying a letter to the knights garrisoned there, telling them to surrender. The letter, supposedly from the head of their order in Jerusalem, was in fact a crude forgery, but the gambit worked. The knights capitulated, and the Sultan took the castle. However, it wasn't until the invention and widespread use of technologies like the printing press and then the radio and the television that the modern conception of news was formulated. The broadsheet, the magazine, and the newspaper started to give people a sense of a regularly published digest of news stories. These technologies also enabled the possibility of mechanizing false news to spread propaganda to the enemy. Some of the most dramatic examples of this came in the 20th century, with the use of airplanes to spread propaganda leaflets.
In the Napoleonic Wars, from ships standing off the French coast, the British launched kites bearing anti-morale leaflets. The employment of military aircraft in World War I made possible the wide dissemination of propaganda leaflets. The leaflet confronts the enemy soldier with a tangible propaganda message which he can keep and refer to. Leaflets also may be distributed by tactical, strategic, and liaison aircraft. This surrender leaflet was used against the enemy in North Korea.
And the use of radio to direct transmissions across enemy lines in the hope of swaying public opinion.
In support of strategic operation, radio may be highly effective, limited only by the range of the transmitter and the availability of radio receivers. Psychological warfare broadcasts are flexible and can be altered swiftly to fit a changing situation.
This was by no means limited to psyops against the enemy, though. The very same techniques have been used throughout history to fool one's own troops in an effort to raise morale. In the Civil War, false news was routinely distributed to Confederate soldiers to boost their spirits before a battle, from false reports of Union General Ulysses S. Grant's death to rumors that a world war was about to break out, with England and France siding with the Confederates. In World War II, false news of reinforcements for the beleaguered American Filipino garrison resisting the Japanese invasion of the Philippines kept them fighting long past the point of their impending defeat. One of the most extreme examples of false information spread to confuse, panic, or disarm a nation, however, are news stories that are completely made up from whole cloth and broadcast as if they are real. These stories, too, although more rare, can be devastatingly effective in confusing and demoralizing enemies, or panicking the public. The proponents of psychological warfare tactics by modern-day governments argue that fears about government propaganda are misplaced, as there are already laws in place to prevent the US government from propagandizing to its own citizens. Indeed, legislation prohibiting government-sponsored domestic propaganda has been in place for nearly 1 century. That legislation, however, is outdated, unenforceable, and routinely breached by the very government agencies that it is supposed to restrain. And as weak and effective as this legislation already is, it is in danger of being even further diluted by a proposed amendment to the 2013 edition of the National Defense Authorization Act.
All right, we've spoken a lot about the National Defense Authorization Bill for 2013 that's working its way through Congress. The version that passed the House last week included $8 billion more than required, thanks to Republicans, as well as provisions banning same-sex marriage ceremonies on military installations and continuing the ban on transfers of Gitmo detainees to U.S. soil. Now, the White House even issued a veto threat for these reasons. But the House passed it anyway. There's also been a battle over amendments attempting to either overturn or limit last year's provision, which allows for indefinite detention, including that of U.S. citizens. While all of that stuff has been publicized, there's another amendment out there that almost slipped by under the radar. Introduced by Representatives Adam Smith and Mac Thornberry, bipartisan team, the amendment aims to strike down a ban on the dissemination of propaganda by the State Department and the Broadcasting Board of Governors on domestic audiences.
The Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012 seeks to update the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which prohibits the State Department's public diplomacy organs from disseminating propaganda intended for foreign audiences domestically. Smith, Thornberry, and other modernization proponents argue that the bill was drafted in a pre-satellite, pre-television, pre-internet era where the public feared the State Department's ability to influence domestic politics. In this day and age of instant online access to websites and videos from anywhere in the world, proponents of the bill argue, the idea of segregating information into foreign and domestic is a futile, if not meaningless, activity. In reality, though, it's unclear what effect the Smith-Mundt Act has had in limiting domestic propaganda at all. There are no clear provisions, bodies, or oversights for its enforcement, and even the State Department itself seems unclear what bureaus are supposed to abide by it. More general prohibitions on domestic propaganda also exist on the books. The 1913 Gillette Amendment, for example, now codified as USC Title V, Section 3107, clearly states, appropriated funds may not be used to pay a publicity expert unless specifically appropriated for that purpose. Moreover, every one of the annual appropriations bills passed by Congress since 1951 has included a stipulation that no part of any appropriation contained in this or any other act shall be used for publicity or propaganda purposes within the United States not heretofore authorized by the Congress. The Department of Defense has its own stipulations against domestic propaganda. Codified in USC Title 10, Section 2241, subsection A, the relevant passage reads, funds available to the Department of Defense may not be obligated or expended for publicity or propaganda purposes within the United States not otherwise specifically authorized by law. As we shall see, however, every one of these laws has been violated both in letter and in spirit by recently exposed PSYOPs campaigns funded by the American taxpayer and aimed directly at the U.S. population. As we have examined in this special series of eye-opener reports on psychological warfare in recent weeks, psychological operations, or PSYOPs, are every bit as vital to military strategists today as they ever were. In fact, in this age of 24/7 online access and the possibilities of new battlegrounds and the information battle space that it affords, PSYOPs may be even more important than they have ever been in winning the hearts and minds, or at least confusing and stupefying the hearts and minds of enemies the world over. In some ways, this is precisely the point. PSYOPs by their very nature tend to rely on mechanical and technological trickery to deceive enemies or sneak propaganda past their defenses. Some of the greatest military victories in history did not involve fighting or bloodshed at all, but merely intimidation through demonstration of technological superiority. During the conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar encountered the problem of securing the eastern border of his newly acquired territory from marauding Germanic tribes. The tribes would raid Gaul when the opportunity arose and retreat back behind the natural barrier of the Rhine River before Roman forces could retaliate. To solve this problem, Caesar put the unparalleled engineering know-how of ancient Rome into a project that had never before been attempted: bridging the Rhine. With ingenious technology, including winch-driven stone pile drivers, and the brute manpower of 40,000 legionaries, Caesar not only accomplished the impossible, he accomplished it in an astonishing 10 days. Having completed the bridge, he marched his troops across to the eastern side, burned down the villages he found there, returned across the bridge to Gaul without a single battle, and tore the bridge down behind him. As an example of psychological warfare, the strategy was devastatingly effective. Without the loss of a single one of his troops, Caesar had effectively demonstrated the awe-inspiring might of the Romans, and the message was not lost on his enemies. Gaul's eastern border suffered no further raids from Germanic marauders for centuries. Although the technology has changed in the ensuing 2,000 years, the basic strategy of terrorizing an enemy via technology remains intact. Ancient armies used drums, pipes, and horns to intimidate their opponents before battle. Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling's eponymous gun was as useful for putting the fear of God into those unlucky enough to be caught in its sights as it was in actually killing them. Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or lightning war strategy, was a combination of intimidation and technological superiority that helped the Nazis gain the upper hand in the early years of World War II. The much-touted shock and awe strategy of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 employed the same concept. Enemy resistance can be drastically reduced by a sudden, overwhelming display of technology and force. As technology has grown ever more sophisticated, however, so too has the ambitions of these psychological operations grown. Whereas traditional PSYOPs have attempted merely to intimidate, bewilder, or demoralize enemies into laying down their arms, modern technologies have opened up the possibility of actually controlling the mind of an opponent directly through electronic, chemical, or other means. PSYOPs, or psychological operations, is a term used to describe the techniques of psychological manipulation used in warfare. These operations are used to deceive, confuse, disrupt, and demoralize the enemy, with an aim toward weakening enemy resistance, or even causing enemy forces to surrender, and enemy populations to capitulate. As the flip side to the ancient wisdom that knowledge is key to all successful warfare strategies, the art of deliberately sowing deception has been understood and practiced for thousands of years. Over 2,000 years ago, the use of deception and psychological manipulation as a tool of combat was detailed in Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu's The Art of War. All warfare is based on deception. Therefore, when capable of attacking, feign incapacity. When active in moving troops, feign inactivity. More than a theory, though, psychological warfare has been used since the dawn of recorded history. One of the earliest and simplest examples of PSYOPs trickery occurred over 3,000 years ago in the Trojan War. In a bid to end the war, the Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving a giant wooden horse as an offering to the goddess Athena. The Trojans, believing themselves to have finally won the battle, took the horse into Troy as a victory trophy. As the legend goes, the horse in fact contained a team of Greek soldiers who slipped out of the horse in the night, opening the city gates for their compatriots who had sailed back under cover of night. The Greeks took the city that night and ended a 10-year siege with one simple act of PSYOPs trickery. Another oft-recounted tale of psychological warfare from the ancient world revolved around Alexander the Great. Contemplating a retreat during one of his Asian campaigns, he was worried that the enemy forces would pursue his army. He is said to have had an oversized suit of armor casted and left behind when his forces withdrew, so that when the enemy found it they would believe him and his men to be giants, dissuading them from pursuit. Genghis Khan's marauding Mongolian hordes were likewise helped by coordinated PSYOPs campaigns. In advance of those campaigns, he would send emissaries to targeted settlements to spread word of the fearsome Mongolian army and to demand surrender. When facing an enemy, Genghis Khan would order his troops to light 3 torches at night to give the impression of greater numbers, and attach instruments to horses' tails so the dust clouds in their wake would make a small force appear much larger. But in the modern age, just as the 20th century gave rise to new techniques of warfare, so too did it see the birth of new methods of PSYOPs, deception, and propaganda. The dawn of the age of air travel began the age of the aerial bombardment. So too did it give rise to the idea of dropping leaflets on enemy installations, urging enemy forces to surrender. Nationalists in the Spanish Civil War used loudspeakers to broadcast messages into Republican areas, urging them to give up the fight. In the Pacific Theater in World War II, Tokyo Rose broadcast Japanese propaganda messages meant to demoralize American GIs. Many of these simple techniques of propaganda dissemination are still used today, like this NATO propaganda broadcast from Italy via shortwave dissuading Libyans from resisting the NATO invasion last year.
NATO warships are here to assist in supporting a United Nations Security Council resolution to enforce a maritime embargo in order to protect Libyan civilians. Do not target NATO vessels. If you target NATO vessels, you will be destroyed.
You've been watching an excerpt of this week's Eye Opener report. To continue watching the report, please log into boilingfrogspost.com.